It was the most dangerous moment in the entire history of the 20th century. We often think of the Cuban Missile Crisis as the closest we came to Armageddon. But in the spring of 1951, the world was not just close to the edge, it was leaning over it. The United States was locked in a brutal, bloody stalemate in Korea. But the real war was happening in Washington. The man pushing for total destruction wasn't Joseph Stalin. It wasn't Mao Zedong. It was America's own American Caesar, the legendary General Douglas MacArthur. His plan was terrifying in its scale. He wanted to drop between 30 and 50 atomic bombs on Chinese cities and industrial hubs. He proposed sewing a permanent belt of radioactive cobalt across the neck of the Korean peninsula, creating a zone of death that would kill anyone attempting to cross it for at least 60 years. He wanted to unleash Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from Taiwan to invade mainland China, a move that would have almost certainly triggered the Soviet Union's Mutual Defense Treaty with Beijing. Standing in the way of this nuclear apocalypse was one man, Harry S. Truman. And in 1951, Truman looked like anything but a savior. He was a failed haberdasher from Missouri, a president who had inherited the office after FDR's death and was now suffering from the lowest approval ratings in history. Lower even than Richard Nixon's would be during Watergate. The press mocked him. The public didn't trust him. His own military commanders viewed him as a weak civilian amateur. But Truman possessed a terrifying secret knowledge that MacArthur ignored. He knew that the Soviet Union had atomic bombs too. He knew that atomic bombers were sitting on runways in Siberia, ready to turn American cities into ash. The tension in the White House was suffocating. Truman wrote in his diary about MacArthur's godlike complex, his inability to understand that war had changed. MacArthur, ruling Japan like a colonial viceroy, openly mocked his commander-in-chief to reporters, calling his orders appeasement and cowardice. The world watched in terror as the two most powerful men in America reached a breaking point. This isn't just a story about a firing. It's the story of how a politician had to destroy a national god to save the human race from extinction. To understand the sheer magnitude of this conflict, you have to understand the colossal figure of Douglas MacArthur. By 1950, he wasn't just a general. He was a living deity to the American public, a figure carved out of granite. He was the man who had promised, "I shall return to the Philippines," and kept his word. He had accepted the Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, ending the greatest war in human history. For the last 5 years, he had ruled occupied Japan not as a soldier, but as a benevolent emperor. He lived in the American embassy in Tokyo, insulated from the devastation outside, traveling in his personal limousine with the license plate 1. He hadn't set foot in the continental United States in 14 years because he believed his destiny lay in the Orient. He surrounded himself with sycophants who called him the General in hushed tones and shielded him from bad news. He controlled his own press, wrote his own communiques in a flowery, archaic style, and believed he answered only to God and history, certainly not to a failed haberdasher temporarily occupying the White House. Harry Truman, on the other hand, was fighting for his political life. His administration was besieged by accusations of corruption, strikes by steelworkers, and the rising hysteria of McCarthyism, which accused his own government of being soft on communism. When the Korean War broke out in June 1950, Truman desperately needed a win. He turned to MacArthur, the only man with the prestige to lead the UN forces. And initially, it seemed like a stroke of genius. In September 1950, MacArthur orchestrated the miracle at Incheon, a risky amphibious landing behind enemy lines that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had warned was impossible due to the treacherous tides and massive seawalls. It was a masterstroke that stunned the world. The Ainamau Korean army collapsed in weeks. MacArthur was vindicated. His ego, already massive, expanded to dangerous proportions. He told Truman that the war was effectively won, famously predicting that the American boys would be home by Christmas and that the Chinese were bluffing. But MacArthur had made a fatal error. Blinded by his own legend, he stopped listening to his intelligence chief, Charles Willoughby, a yes-man who was feeding him exactly what he wanted to hear. Willoughby systematically dismissed reports of thousands of Chinese troops moving into the mountains, dismissing them as volunteers. As MacArthur marched his troops confidently toward the Yalu River, the border with China, he wasn't just marching into battle, he was walking straight into a trap that would shatter his reputation and nearly destroy the U.S. Army.
Before the disaster struck, there was one final bizarre attempt to bridge the gap between the president and the general. In October 1950, just weeks before the Chinese invasion, Truman decided to meet MacArthur face to face, but he had to fly halfway around the world to do it. They agreed to meet on Wake Island, a tiny, desolate coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It was a power play disguised as a strategy meeting. Truman wanted to look the general in the eye and remind him who was boss. But from the moment the president's plane, the Independence, touched down, the disrespect was palpable. MacArthur was already on the ground. He didn't walk to the plane to greet the president as protocol demanded. Instead, he waited at the terminal, hands in his pockets, wearing an old, shabby flight cap that Truman later complained looked like it had been used for 20 years. When Truman stepped off the plane, MacArthur didn't salute his commander-in-chief. He simply offered a casual handshake and didn't even bother to button his jacket. Truman was furious, but kept his composure for the cameras. In their private one-hour meeting in a hot, un-air-conditioned shack, Truman asked the only question that really mattered. "General, what are the chances of Chinese or Soviet interference?" MacArthur didn't hesitate. He leaned back, took a puff of his pipe, and delivered one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in history. "Very little," he said. "If they tried to cross the Yalu River, there will be the greatest slaughter in history. We have the air power. We will destroy them." He assured Truman the war was over. He was arrogant, dismissive, and tragically wrong. Even as he spoke those words, 300,000 Chinese soldiers were already moving silently through the mountains of North Korea, moving only at night to avoid detection, waiting to spring the trap. November 1950. The trap snapped shut with terrifying violence. As American troops approached the Yalu River, expecting a quick victory march, the mountains around them erupted. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops wearing white quilted uniforms for camouflage poured out of the forests like ghosts. They attacked primarily at night to avoid American air power, announcing their assaults with a cacophony of bugles, whistles, and gongs that terrified the young American conscripts in the pitch blackness. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The U.S. Eighth Army in the West and the X-Corps at the Chosin Reservoir were completely encircled. It wasn't just a battle. It was a slaughter. And to make matters worse, the Siberian winter had arrived early, bringing with it a new silent enemy, the cold. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, turning the battlefield into a frozen hellscape. The conditions were apocalyptic. Weapon lubricants froze, causing M1 rifles and machine guns to jam at critical moments. Medical plasma turned into solid blocks of ice, making it impossible to treat the wounded. Men's skin stuck to the frozen metal of their tanks and artillery. Soldiers who fell asleep in their foxholes never woke up, freezing to death in their sleep. At the chosen reservoir, 30,000 UN troops, later known as the Frozen Chosen, were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers. The casualty lists were horrifying. Over 4,000 Americans killed or wounded in battle, but nearly 7,000 incapacitated by frostbite alone. It became the longest and most brutal retreat in U.S. military history, a fighting withdrawal to the port of Hungnam where the Navy waited to evacuate them. Back in Tokyo, MacArthur was in shock. His hubris had led his men into a meat grinder. But instead of taking responsibility, he lashed out. He sent frantic, almost hysterical cables to Washington, claiming that he was facing an entirely new war and that the situation was hopeless without escalation. He blamed the restrictions placed on him by Truman. He demanded permission to bomb China, to blockade their coast, to unleash total war. He didn't care about the geopolitical consequences. He only cared about saving his reputation. Truman read the cables with horror. He realized that MacArthur had lost his nerve and was now trying to drag the world into World War III to cover up his mistake. The conflict was no longer just about strategy. It was about the Constitution itself. Who runs the United States, the elected president or the generals? In December 1950, after MacArthur had embarrassed him at Wake Island and then blamed Washington for the debacle in Korea, Truman tried to regain control. On December 6th, he issued a direct order, soon dubbed the Gag Order, forbidding any military commander from making public statements on foreign policy without prior approval from the State Department. The order was technically issued to all commanders, but everyone knew it was aimed squarely at MacArthur. It was a direct message: shut up and fight the war.
Truman was frantically trying to open back-channel peace negotiations with China to stop the bleeding and restore the pre-war border at the 38th parallel. He knew that if he could get a ceasefire, he could prevent a nuclear exchange and save thousands of lives. But MacArthur decided to torpedo the peace process. He viewed anything less than total victory as surrender, as weakness. In March 1951, just as Truman was about to send a carefully worded peace proposal to Beijing, MacArthur issued his own unauthorized ultimatum to the Chinese commander. On March 24, he released a statement mocking China's military weakness and threatening to expand the war to the Chinese mainland if they didn't surrender. It was an act of deliberate sabotage. The Chinese, humiliated, refused to negotiate. Truman's peace initiative was dead on arrival. But unbeknownst to the president, the final trap had already been set.
Days earlier, on March 20, MacArthur had written a private letter to Joseph Martin, the Republican minority leader in Congress and a fierce critic of Truman. In it, he openly trashed the president's policy of limited war. He wrote, "Here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest," and famously concluded, "There is no substitute for victory." On April 5th, Martin read the letter aloud on the floor of the House of Representatives. It was an earthquake. The top commander in the field was openly aligning himself with the opposition party to undermine the president during wartime. It was essentially mutiny. When Truman heard about it, his face went white. He slammed his hand on the desk. He convened an emergency meeting with his top advisors, General George Marshall, General Omar Bradley, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and W. Averill Harriman. They debated for days behind closed doors. Some hesitated. After all, MacArthur was a national hero. But the conclusion was unanimous and terrifying. General Marshall, a man MacArthur had once served under, delivered the final verdict. "If you don't fire him, you are not the president. You are just a figurehead. The military must be subordinate to civil authority." Truman knew what he had to do. He was about to commit political suicide, but the Constitution was at stake. Truman wanted to handle the firing with the dignity of a state funeral. He planned to send a personal envoy, Secretary of the Army Frank Pace, to Tokyo to deliver the news quietly and respectfully, allowing MacArthur to resign gracefully and save face. But in a final twist of fate, the plan was botched by a breakdown in communications. A power failure delayed the message to Pace, and simultaneously a leak occurred in Washington. A reporter for the Chicago Tribune found out that the general was about to be axed. Truman, terrified that MacArthur would hear the rumor and resign first, making himself a martyr who quit in protest, decided he had to act immediately. He couldn't let MacArthur control the narrative one last time. At 1 a.m. on April 11, 1951, the White House hastily convened a press conference. Press Secretary Joe Short, sleepy, disheveled, and barely dressed, handed out a simple mimeographed statement to a confused room of reporters. "With deep regret, I have concluded that General of the Army Douglas MacArthur is unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government." It was done. The most famous general in American history was fired like a disobedient clerk. MacArthur didn't even get a telegram. He found out about his own firing while eating lunch with his wife in Tokyo, hearing it on a casual radio broadcast. His wife, Jean, wept openly. The general sat in stony, stunned silence, his face a mask of shock. The reaction back home was volcanic. It was arguably the most unpopular decision in presidential history. Truman was burned in effigy in towns across America. State legislatures passed resolutions condemning him. Flags were flown at half-staff in protest. Telegrams poured into the White House by the thousands, calling Truman a Judas, a traitor, a drunkard, and a communist sympathizer. Impeachment calls rang out in Congress, with Republicans demanding the president's head. A truck driver famously drove past the White House, shouting, "Impeach the red son of a bitch!"
Truman went to bed that night knowing he might have just committed political suicide, but he slept soundly for the first time in months. He knew he had done the one thing that had to be done. He had reasserted the absolute control of the elected government over the military machine.
But reasserting control came at a terrible price. When MacArthur returned to the United States, it wasn't a dismissal, it was a coronation. On April 20th, 1951, New York City threw him a ticker-tape parade that shattered all records. 7.5 million people lined the Canyon of Heroes to cheer him, double the crowd that had greeted Eisenhower after defeating Hitler. It was mass hysteria. Over 3,000 tons of paper rained down from the skyscrapers, creating a confetti blizzard so dense that drivers had to use windshield wipers just to see the road. It was a hero's welcome for a man who had essentially been fired for insubordination, a collective outpouring of grief and rage against the politicians in Washington. MacArthur then addressed a joint session of Congress, a rare honor usually reserved for foreign heads of state. He delivered one of the most famous pieces of political theater in American history. His voice trembling with carefully practiced emotion, he defended his strategy and famously declared, "I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye." There wasn't a dry eye in the building. Congressmen wept openly. Republicans saw him as their savior, their ticket to the White House in 1952. Harry Truman watched the spectacle from the Oval Office on a small television set. He wasn't moved by the theatrics. He turned to an aide and called the speech a bunch of damn bullshit, adding, he didn't fade away, he marched right into the arms of the Republicans. Truman knew something the crowd didn't. Emotions fade, but facts remain. He decided to give the general enough rope to hang himself. The Senate opened hearings into the firing, and for weeks the Truman administration methodically dismantled MacArthur's legend. Generals and experts testified that MacArthur's intelligence was flawed and his arrogance dangerous. Then came the killing blow. General Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and a man of unimpeachable integrity, delivered a devastating verdict. He stated that MacArthur's strategy of expanding the war into China would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. It was a cold shower for the American public. They realized that while MacArthur looked like a hero, his plans were a recipe for national suicide. Truman hadn't fired a patriot. He had fired a reckless gambler who had almost bet the entire country on a bad hand.
Let's pause and imagine, just for a moment, if Truman hadn't fired him. What would have happened if MacArthur got his way? We now know from declassified Soviet archives just how close we were to the abyss. MacArthur wanted to unleash Chiang Kai-shek against the mainland and drop atomic bombs on industrial centers in Manchuria. Stalin was terrified of this scenario, but he was also prepared for it. The Soviets had secretly moved elite air regiments equipped with MiG-15s into China. They had their own nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. If American B-29s had crossed into Chinese airspace with nuclear payloads, World War III would have almost certainly started in the spring of 1951. The Soviet Union would have been forced to honor its treaty with China. Soviet submarines would have attacked American supply convoys in the Pacific. Soviet bombers could have targeted U.S. bases in Japan or even cities on the West Coast. And while America was bogged down in an endless radioactive war in Asia,
The Red Army would have likely rolled across Western Europe, which was virtually defenseless at the time. Truman's weakness, his refusal to go all in, was actually his greatest strength. By accepting a stalemate in Korea, a frustrating war without total victory, he preserved the post-war order. He understood the concept of limited war, a new and terrifying reality of the nuclear age, where you couldn't just win anymore. You had to manage survival. MacArthur belonged to the 19th century, where glory was everything. Truman belonged to the 20th century, where survival was everything. The firing of MacArthur was effectively the first major decision of the Cold War that prioritized nuclear restraint over military victory. The Korean War ended exactly where it started, at the 38th parallel. There was no grand victory parade, no surrender ceremony on a battleship. It is often called the Forgotten War, sandwiched between the glory of WWI and the trauma of Vietnam. But the decision to keep it limited is why we are here today to talk about it. Truman left office in 1953 with an approval rating of 22%, the lowest ever recorded. He was reviled as the man who lost China and fired a hero. But history has a funny way of correcting itself. Time has been incredibly kind to Harry Truman. Historians now consistently rank him as one of the top 10 presidents, often placing him near the giants like Lincoln and FDR. Why? Because he had the guts to do the unpopular thing when it mattered most. MacArthur faded away just as he predicted. He tried to run for president in 1952, but failed miserably. The Republican Party chose Eisenhower, a general who understood moderation. MacArthur retired to the penthouse of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, a bitter old man surrounded by memories of past glories, never understanding why he couldn't bomb his way to victory. He died a hero, yes, but a hero of a bygone era, a relic. Truman died knowing that he kept the nuclear genie in the bottle. The police action in Korea was ugly, frustrating, and unsatisfying, but it accomplished its goal. It held the line against communism without ending the world. So why does this story matter to you today? Because the conflict between civilian control and military aggression never went away. It is the ghost in the machine of every democracy. Every president since Truman has faced generals who wanted to do more, bomb more, invade more, escalate more. Kennedy faced Curtis LeMay during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Obama faced Stanley McChrystal in Afghanistan. But the precedent was set in stone in 1951. Truman drew a line in the sand that no general has dared to cross since. In the United States, the person with their finger on the button is the one elected by the people, not the one wearing the medals. The military is a tool of the state, not its master. If Truman had blinked, if he had allowed MacArthur to dictate policy, the presidency itself would have been reduced to a ceremonial role, and the Pentagon would have become the true seat of power. Truman proved that being tough doesn't mean dropping the biggest bomb or shouting the loudest. It means having the moral strength to say no when everyone else is screaming yes. It means accepting being hated in the present to be vindicated by the future. He saved the Constitution from a military coup in all but name, and quite possibly he saved the human race. On his desk in the Oval Office sat a small walnut sign with a simple motto: "The buck stops here." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a philosophy. It meant that he couldn't pass the blame to Congress, to the press, or to his advisors. He had to make the hard calls and live with the consequences. And on that cold April morning in 1951, the buck stopped with the firing of an American god. It was the bravest, loneliest, and most important decision a president ever made. Truman left office unpopular and mocked, but he left with his soul intact. He walked away from power knowing that he had denied the mob their war, and in doing so, he gave his successors the authority to keep the world safe. History has finally caught up to Harry Truman. He showed us that the true measure of a leader isn't how many wars they win, but how many unnecessary ones they prevent.